This is Market Pathways, your premium guide to global medical device regulation, reimbursement, and policy. Become a part of the global Medtech community at mystrategist.com.
Welcome to the Market Pathways podcast. I'm Steve Levin, Editor-in-Chief of Market Pathways, and today's discussion will focus on an area of growing importance in the medical device industry, and that is the use of real-world evidence. One of the companies pioneering the use of real-world evidence is Johnson & Johnson, and our discussion today will be with Paul Coplan, who is leading that effort at J&J. Our discussion today will be far-ranging, which is appropriate given the broad use of real-world evidence, and we'll talk about J&J's leadership in this area and how they have pioneered the use of real-world evidence in medical devices. We'll also touch on important issues like the recent FDA guidance on real-world evidence and talk about the global use of real-world evidence, specifically the use of real-world evidence in China, as well as using real-world evidence in areas like health equity and AI. We'll try to keep the use of acronyms to a minimum, which we always do on the podcast, but one that you'll hear repeatedly is NEST. And NEST is an important organization that has been driving the use of real-world evidence. It's the creation of the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, MDIC, so guilty there of adding another acronym. And as MDIC is a partnership of industry and regulators. And if you want to learn more about MDIC and NEST, I encourage you to look at the numerous articles that we've done in Market Pathways to provide you with more background on that space. So with that, I hope you enjoy today's podcast, the interview with Paul Coplan. Well, it's my pleasure this morning to welcome Paul Coplan of J&J to the Market Pathways podcast. And Paul, thank you very much for joining us.
Hello, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be with you and to speak with your audience today through the podcast.
We're going to be talking about a topic that has become increasingly important and I think will just continue to grow in terms of the impact on really a wide variety of aspects of the medical device industry, and that is the use of real-world evidence. So, Paul, why don't we start with a little background on yourself for people who may not be familiar as to the role that you play at J&J.
Great, thanks, Steve. Well, I became interested in real-world evidence through kind of a long pathway. I started. I was training as a physician in South Africa, and I took a 1-year leave of absence from medical school to go work for a charitable organization called Oxfam, Oxford Famine Relief, in Zimbabwe, in a remote rural area that was had healthcare from one doctor through a mission hospital. And I was assisting the doctor in reinstating the healthcare system that had been shut down during a civil war. And I helped the doctor with the clinical work, but I also helped with the community-based work. And through that, I realized that one could help more people by working on a population level. And that's how I kind of started to look more at population-based medicine rather than individual clinical medicine. That led me into the field of epidemiology. So I studied first a master's degree at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and then a PhD at Harvard in epidemiology and biostatistics, and was about to go into kind of public health work, but read a great article in the Rolling Stone magazine, a musical magazine, about this incredible work that was happening at Merck in developing new drugs for HIV.
Well,
And
let me just interrupt you there to tell you, I can say without fear of contradiction that this is the first time in any of our publications or podcasts that Rolling Stone has been referenced on Market Pathways or MedTech Strategies. So we appreciate that reference.
There was the article was just about how this great science was happening at Merck. I don't know why it was in Rolling Stone, and how it was very likely to be successful. So instead of going into public health when I graduated from Harvard, I went into I got an offer to go work at Merck in developing these HIV drugs that I'd read about in Rolling Stone. I was like, well, I could do a lot of public health research, or I could actually go help develop new medicines that would help the epidemic. So that's why I went into industry, and in the role of an epidemiologist, which is really real world evidence, and kind of helped develop 9 vaccines and then 9 drugs. And now, and then more recently, I've been working in the area of medical devices for the last 7 years at J&J, in the application of real world evidence for the medtech industry. And so what we've noticed in the medtech industry is there's been a huge takeoff of real world evidence for medical devices for a number of different reasons. One of them being that there isn't a lot of clinical evidence. There's a number of barriers to collecting clinical trials. Mostly medical devices are used in the context of surgeries, and it's difficult to enroll patients in surgeries in terms of large numbers of patients. And so we tend to see smaller clinical trials. But also, I think the mindset for medical devices is more on the engineering, technological innovation side. So, for example, if you get a new iPhone or Samsung phone, that doesn't have to go through a big phase 3 trial to get approved. It's approved based on its technological capabilities. And so similarly, a lot of medical devices, since they offer an iterative improvements on a stapler or a cutter or a scope that have been used for hundreds, if not thousands of years in medicine, they don't necessarily have to go through these big clinical trials. So often there's a gap in clinical evidence that real world evidence can substitute for. And therefore, we've seen a lot of openness by FDA and payers to look at real world evidence because there is the absence of other clinical evidence. And in fact, the FDA created a special public-private partnership called the National Evaluation System for Health Technology, or NEST, to try and nurture the use of real world evidence for medical devices so that they could get better quality, safety, and effectiveness information on medical devices. So what we've been doing at J&J is looking at how we can unlock the revolution that's happening with AI, big data, huge computing power, analytics, putting all of these together with some of the technological advances that are happening in medtech, which have just been exponential in terms of all of the tools that we see, for example, in cars, like navigation tools. Where cars have become more of a computerized digital process more and more, so that whether it's automatic crash protection or lane assist, and ultimately moving to driverless cars. Similarly, within medtech, we've seen a lot of the introduction of incredible technological advances to make surgical procedures so much more efficient and safe, and to do things that we never could do before. For example, if someone has a stroke, ischemic stroke, we can pass a catheter through their wrist into the brain and pull the stroke out of the brain. If someone has atrial fibrillation, that used to be something that people had to take drugs for the rest of their life, or with drugs with fairly significant side effects. Now we can do a procedure that's outpatient, for the most part, very safe, and just in 80% of the patients will cure their atrial fibrillation for the rest of their life. So so putting those technological advances in the medtech industry with the technological advances in data and analytics and computing power, to see how we can bring those two together to create this benevolent feedback loop, a learning healthcare system where surgery used to be the domain of experts who did fantastic work in their surgical procedures. but it was very much anecdotal. They based it on their personal experience for the most part, or their apprenticeship, and now adding to that a kind of AI-based big data system where we can start to see what's working, what's not working in which patients, and through that evolving the practice of surgery, which is a key branch of medicine. When medicine consists of drugs and surgery, and that aspect of surgery hasn't had as much of that big data input as the pharmaceutical side has, and so bringing that to surgical procedures, I think, has been for me very rewarding, just to be able to make a difference in patients' lives.
And I think one of the real exciting things about your experience is that you do bring a combination of drug and device experience to this field. Let's start out by talking about some of the top emerging trends. And one area that comes to mind is new active surveillance initiatives. And the FDA recently funded a central data operations hub initiative in collaboration with Booz Allen. And just, I wonder if you could address trends, not only in the U.S., but we're also, again, this is real, and we should emphasize this throughout the podcast, that real world evidence really is a growing global trend. And we know there's a lot of stuff going on in the EU with the new medical device regulation, MDR, and also in China. So why don't you go ahead and address some of these new active surveillance initiatives?
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so just before going on to the new initiative, just wanted to comment on your previous thing about the interface between what we've learned on the pharma side and then and bringing that to the medtech side. And so at J&J, I've been fortunate to work in a group called the Office of the Chief Medical Officer, or OCMO, that sits across the two sectors. It used to be the three sectors when we had consumer products. And the Office of the Chief Medical Officer combines safety science, epidemiology, and bioethics across the whole enterprise of J&J. And so we have this cross-learning that's occurring constantly between the two sectors of pharma and medtech, but also between epidemiology and safety science and bioethics. The role of the OCMO is to use the best science to understand the safety and effectiveness of products, and to inform important regulatory and clinical decisions, but always putting the patient first. That's kind of our niche in the company. Everyone puts patients first, but we have a more specific focus on that. Coming back to the active surveillance initiatives. Yes, as you mentioned, FDA has created this initiative looking at active surveillance of medical devices. They are focusing two areas to start with. So they put out an RFP. Booz Allen Hamilton won it, a request for proposal. That work is actively ongoing. It's the two examples that they're looking at are. One is in radical prostatectomy, and the other one is in disposable duodenoscopes. And they were chosen as two kind of areas where it was kind of relevant areas to do active surveillance. What they're actually using is, in terms of the early feasibility to look at the active surveillance, is synthetic data, which is one of the themes in terms of innovation that's been occurring, which is that through computer generation, we can mimic the distributions of data sets. So, in order to get active surveillance of medical devices, to have an adequate sample size, in order to be able to look at statistical significance, we have to have enough statistical power. That requires an active sample size. As I mentioned, oftentimes with surgical procedures, there may not be huge sample sizes, not enough necessarily for once we start subsetting into specific surgeries, specific approaches, specific devices that are used, that in one healthcare system, you may not have enough information. So what they've been looking at is aggregating across different healthcare systems. So, for example, we could work with a a large healthcare system like Mayo Clinic or Mercy Health or Leahy Hospital System or Kaiser Permanente. These are large aggregated healthcare systems that have very good electronic health record systems. And what we can do is look at people who had a procedure for, say, we're looking at a prostatectomy. We can see, was the prostatectomy done, which is removal of the prostate, often because there's prostate cancer. That can be done by open or laparoscopic or robotic, different approaches. So we may be interested in, is there a difference between the laparoscopic, the open, or the robotic approach? So we'll look retrospectively in the electronic health record database where the prostatectomies were done by these different approaches, but the approaches may be used in different types of patients. So we have to, maybe patients who are sicker maybe get one kind of procedure, or patients who are more likely to have more advanced cancer that use an approach where they could be more sure that they wouldn't get spread of the cancer but when the prostate is removed. So the condition of the patient may influence which procedure, which type of approach to the prostatectomy is used. So we have to balance the patients on their underlying risks of based on the underlying covariates. So doing that, which is called propensity score balancing, which has been a big advance on the method side. And so what they found with the active surveillance is they needed to combine multiple healthcare systems to get a big enough sample size. That can either be done in what's called a federated approach, which is each healthcare system analyzes their own data and compares, say, open surgery versus laparoscopic versus robotic, balancing the patient covariates, as we call them, across the three different approaches. Or and then you take the data from each healthcare system and add it together in a weighted way. Or what they're doing is using synthetic data where they can basically generate take the actual data, which is, of course, has HIPAA implications. So all of these data sets that we use are statistically de-identified. They have to be certified to make sure that no individual patient can be identified. And so that we're only looking at the aggregate of information without any personal identifiers. But even so, there's still reluctance for, say, one healthcare system to share their data with another healthcare system for combining to create one data set for the study. So in what the FDA is doing in their current active surveillance is using synthetic data, which they'll take the data from, say, a Mayo Clinic and a Mercy Health, and then they will, and maybe a Yale, and they will generate data that looks like the original data. It's not the actual data, but it looks like it has the same statistical parameters, and then that they can combine because it's not any actual patient data, it's just synthetic data that mimics the real data. Combine that into one big data set and analyze that. So these are some of the kind of the techniques that are being developed to make sure we can start to get active surveillance at a large enough sample size. Now, the FDA should be releasing the results of that active surveillance work in the next few months. It's actively ongoing. In the EU, we've seen, as you mentioned, we've seen a different approach, which is there's been a lot of concern in the EU around medical devices being approved through this kind of the engineering pathway, as I mentioned, and not necessarily having enough clinical data to demonstrate safety. And so what the European Union, and there was a lot of concern about the surgical vaginal mesh and whether that was safe and issues that emerged with the safety of that. So the EU has come out with rules that companies who have medical devices that are used, that have the CE mark in Europe, so that, the certification mark in Europe, which allows devices or technology of any sort to be sold in the European Union. In order to maintain that CE mark, the companies have to have clinical follow-up, which is an active surveillance system to make sure that the product is safe and is effective. And that often has to be clinical evidence. So that again has been useful to use real-world evidence to fulfill those requirements. since oftentimes through these databases there's large amounts of information on how the product is being used and if it's being used safely and leading to the results that are expected. So that's been another large area that we and others have been using for in the European Union, using real-world evidence. In China,
let me just interject also, Paul, that one of the big areas of concern that product companies have with MDR is the additional clinical data requirements that the new regulation is imposing. And from what I'm hearing about companies, they like very much the fact that real-world evidence and the use of kind of post-marketing clinical follow-up helps them provide that kind of data in a more efficient way.
Unknown caller. That's correct, yes.
And China is another place where, again, in order to obtain product registration, they're trying to come up with an alternative to Chinese clinical trials. And my understanding is that, again, real world evidence is being tried there to make that process more efficient.
Yes, the practice of regulatory approval for medical devices in China has been that once the product is China itself has a very big and growing set of medical device companies. Apparently, there are 5,000 medical device companies based in China. But for products that are where the innovation has occurred in Europe or the US and gets approved in the US or China or Europe, in order to get approved for use in China, the Chinese National Medical Products Association, or NMPA, has required that there has to be a clinical study of the device in China before it can be licensed. So if it's a US device, it first have to get FDA approval. Once it has FDA approval, then a study can it needs a clinical study in China. That often will take about 4 years, because by the time you get the product approved in the US and you get the study started, enroll patients and then analyze it, it can take 4 years. So what's been happening is that the sophistication of the medical devices in China has been a little bit lagging Europe, where the issue was, where the technological innovation was coming from the US and Europe. And so what China had, we went over three times to China to speak to them about. They held a number of fora to look at how FDA was using Nest, how FDA was approaching Nest, and how real world evidence was being used in the US. They thought very deeply about it, and they came up with their own adaptation of it, which is very ingenious in a way. So there is a province called Hainan, which is it's an island in the south of China, and not too far from Hong Kong, and it's a province, and they set up a kind of an independent zone for bringing in devices that are approved by the FDA or Europe into the zone, into a large hospital called Boer Lichang, and then studying it in that large hospital. It's a huge hospital, just like 5,000 beds, this enormous hospital. And they set up a electronic health record information system to study devices in that hospital and generate the data for that device through real-world evidence in this hospital, and using that in lieu of the clinical trial evidence in China that was required previously. So what that's done is expedite the approval of new medical devices in China so they can get the technology earlier. It's also helped with Chinese patients. Sometimes with Chinese patients, one of the latest technology, they'd have to leave China to go to Malaysia or Europe or somewhere else, the US, to get that latest technology. Now they can get that latest technology in the south of China in this one province island. So we, for example, had a technology that we've been J&J had a robotic system for cataract surgery that helps with the planning to get the incisions for the putting the lens in the eye. the new lens in the eye, to get that very exact and driven by robotics. And it took about 10 years. It was approved about 10 years ago in the US and Europe and 66 other countries. We couldn't get it approved in China because of the absence of the necessary evidence. But through the Bo Le Chang initiative, we could introduce the cataract robots into China. They were tested, the evidence was found to be adequate, and the product got approved in China through that process.
Hey, have you heard of Market Pathways? Market Pathways provides the most in-depth analysis you'll find of the changes happening in medical device regulation and reimbursement every day. They address the complexity in regulatory affairs and beyond by helping you digest and contextualize technical topics like Medicare and MDR. Visit mystrategist.com/trial today to start your free 5-day trial to Market Pathways. Again, that's mystrategist.com/trial for 5 days of online access.
Everyone, I'm Joey Brenneman from Offscript Health, and we are excited to introduce you to Offscript Health's latest podcast series called Before We Die, the world's best podcast about the medtech industry. Every day, advances in technology are providing new, less invasive options in healthcare. Many of them are born out of the idea that there has to be a better way. On this show, we will be talking with the rock star innovators and inventors of the medtech industry who felt the same way, which inspired them to create a new device or challenge a way that a procedure was done. And most people don't even know who they are. So download and subscribe to Before We Die, wherever you get your podcasts. You'll get full episodes every Tuesday, and on Thursdays, you'll get our Lab Before Slab mini episodes where Sandy, John, and Craig geek out about the latest happenings in the medtech world. Who would have thought that medical innovation could be so riveting?
I'm glad you mentioned that because it's a great segue into the next area I wanted to touch on, which is the use of real-world evidence applications in label extensions. And I mention that because J&J really has been a pioneer in that area in terms of being the first example of the first label extension that the FDA approved for a medical device or a drug, frankly, that was based solely on a comparative real-world evidence study using electronic health record databases. Nest has launched a series of 20-some test cases and looking at the areas of, so looking at real-world evidence, label extensions, and the J&J success was the first such case. So why don't you talk a little bit about the Biosense Webster project, the label extension, because J&J really was breaking new ground here.
Sure. Thank you, Stephen. Yeah. So personally, this has been a personal goal, because I started working in real-world evidence in the life sciences industries about 27 years ago. And my first work was on addressing some of the safety issues and effectiveness of the varicella vaccine, then the shingles vaccine, and then subsequently the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. And so there we did a lot of large, population studies to look at outcomes in the communities, and then trying to see if we could get that into the label. It was very difficult to get that into the label. Then I worked actually on abuse-deterrent opioids, and there was a question of for abuse-deterrent opioids, could you get that in the label? And what level of efficacy and effectiveness in national surveillance systems would you need to get in order to get a label, put something in the label that abuse-deterrent formulations of opiates really did reduce the abuse? So when I came to medical devices, I was very keen to see if we could actually get a label extension based on the opportunities that clearly this was a goal of FDA's through NEST, the National Evaluation System for Health Technology. And really, when we look at what NEST really set out as their goals, there were two goals. One was to see if real-world evidence could be used for label extensions, and secondly for safety surveillance, for active surveillance. And we see NEST continuing to work in both of those. A secondary area was in initial approval of devices. Real-world evidence can be a potent part of the totality of evidence, not necessarily always sufficient for evidence, but there are some examples of that. So with when the way FDA approached this was to fund 21 use cases to look at where companies proposed ideas for studies. NEST matched that with different healthcare systems that had good researchers and good databases, so that there was a partnership with the company was coming with the idea of what needed to be done, and the healthcare systems were getting funded by NEST to do the work to evaluate that particular research question. And there were 21 that were funded. One of them was a project that we did at J&J, led by myself and Shuming Zhang. And we actually got funded 4 test cases. 2 were safety and 2 were label extensions. We found for the safety, it worked pretty well. And that's kind of been some of the work that's now going into the active surveillance work that I mentioned earlier that FDA is doing. And then of the 2 label extension studies that we looked at, one was for a microwave ablation catheter for liver tumors, but we couldn't take that to a label extension because we just couldn't get the long-term cancer outcomes which were needed for that label extension. But the other one was for a cardiac ablation catheter to treat atrial fibrillation. As I mentioned earlier, atrial fibrillation affects about 20 million Americans a year. It increases the risk of stroke and heart failure by about 5-fold. So, important to treat, as well as being very uncomfortable and pleasant for the patient. And it can be, this new technology allows it to be treated through a short procedure that can take 60 minutes, remarkably safe relative to the of course it always has some side effects, but it's remarkably safe. And what we've seen is the technology has been incrementally improving in the catheters that are used, because the catheters are introduced into the heart by the electrophysiologist doctor, and the doctor creates scarring tissue inside the atrium of the heart that isolates the area of the heart where this aberrant or problematic signal is occurring, because the heart is should have a sinus rhythmia that's one rhythm. Sometimes certain parts of the heart will start to beat at a different rhythm, and that electrical signal confuses the heart. Then the heart doesn't pump well, and then you get blood pooling in the heart, and that can cause clots, which causes a stroke. So the idea is to create scar tissue around through mapping, very sophisticated electromagnetic mapping, identify beat in the heart coming from, and create scarring tissue around that so that beat can't spread. And the technology keeps improving on how to do that. So different iterations or generations of the technology doesn't necessarily have the label. So every time you iterate the technology, you now have to go do another 4 or 5 studies, clinical studies, to go and get all the labels for ischemic, for early stage atrial fibrillation, late stage atrial fibrillation. Also, there's atrial and the ventricle of the heart, so there's different, there's ischemic ventricular tachycardia and non-ischemic. So every time you kind of get a new technology, you have to do all these clinical trials to get that catheter to have all of the necessary applications in its label. So instead of doing a clinical trial, what we proposed is that we would take the newer generation of the technology, compare it to the older generation of the technology that had a label extension for the particular indication we're looking for, and then show that the 2 generations of technology are non-inferior in terms of safety and effectiveness. We were able to do that, and based on that, so we worked with Mayo Clinic and Mercy Health. Joe Drozda at Mercy was the lead, and he was just a wonderful a champion of this and in making it happen. Based in St. Louis, Missouri, and we were able to compare the 2 catheter patient cohorts who'd been ablated with one catheter versus the other catheter, match the patients in terms of their age and gender and severity of heart failure and other conditions, as well as the hospital size, as well as the electrophysiologist experience, because the more experienced someone is in this procedure, the better the outcomes. And based on that, we were able to show non-inferiority and get the label extension through NEST. And this was the first study that NEST had that led to a label extension. Subsequently, there's been a second one, which was done by NEST in partnership with Intuitive Surgical for radical prostatectomy. So the number one surgery for robotically assisted surgery has been radical prostatectomy, removal of the prostate. And the label for the robot has been kind of very general, and so this was the first time that they actually looked at a study for this application and got it approved. So that's been the second label extension that NEST has received. We then took the lessons from the NEST test case and then applied it to other label extensions outside of the NEST environment that were important for Johnson & Johnson and for Byson's Webster, which is a company that makes these catheters. So one of the things is that in order to have successful surgeries, the and navigation and guidance systems are incredibly important for the successful outcome. It used to be that the guidance system used X-ray to identify where the catheter was and make sure the ones are blading in the right place. But through better technology, one no longer needs to use X-ray, which is a tremendous advantage because you're not exposing the patient to X-ray and you're not exposing the electrophysiologist to X-ray. And also the electrophysiologist doesn't have to wear heavy lead shielding the whole day in order to do the work. But the label required that X-ray be used because that was how it was done originally. So we were able to show in Mercy data, as well as in a large registry, that when X-ray wasn't used, the outcomes were just as safe and just as effective with the newer and better imaging technology. And NEST has developed this new process called the NEST Mark, which is a process in which they work with the companies who have interest in using real-world evidence for a label extension, that they'll come to NEST, and NEST will work with the FDA to figure out if the proposed real-world evidence data is fit for purpose. Because a big issue with using real-world evidence for regulatory decisions is that does the data have the quality? Does it really answer the questions? Is it valid? Even if it says that the patient had a safety event, did they really have that safety event? Or was it just that they had the safety event 5 years ago and they came back in and the physician just said, oh, 5 years ago they had that safety event, so I'll just check them to make sure there was no concern with that. So those are some of the things that have to be worked out in the database to make sure that the data is fit for purpose. Now, FDA has come up with a guidance document to help sponsors on how to use real-world evidence. And so NEST now has, through this NEST Mark process, can work with the sponsor and FDA to determine, is the data source that's being proposed actually fit for purpose? Does it have the data quality? Does it answer the questions, the research question? Is it sufficient evidence for the label extension that the sponsor, the company, is intending?
So in December, I think I'm right, December of 2023, the agency issued this guidance, and the comments from industry, I think generally can be characterized as saying that they're appreciative of the guidance and thought it was an improvement from the existing guidance, which goes back to 2017, but still had some room for additional improvement. So why don't we start, before we get too far into the weeds on that, just, Paul, give us your general impression of the new guidance.
Yeah, well, when FDA came up with the real-world evidence guidance for medical devices in 2017, it was the first branch of FDA to come up with a real-world evidence guidance to support regulatory decisions. So it's been CDRH has been a precedent setter in the guidance in this area. Subsequently, CDER, the drug part of FDA, and CBER, the biologics, has also come out with excellent guidance documents for using real world evidence for regulatory decisions. However, the 2017 device was like a broad stroke approach, and so when it came time to, well, what are the criteria that really need to be met in order to be considered fit for purpose for the research question, you couldn't really use the 2017 guidance for that purpose. It gave you a general sense of that FDA was interested and the general framework that FDA was using to evaluate real world evidence, but none of the specifics. So the 2023 guidance was intended to bring more specificity to guide, on both sides, guide the companies on how to put together a package of evidence, and for the FDA reviewers, how to evaluate a submission by the companies, and also importantly, sending a message to the data vendors, because one of the things we've seen is a huge growth of business in data vendors. It's a very growing and profitable industry, and so signaling to the startup companies that are starting to aggregate and sell these data, what good looks like and what's the bar that they need to jump over in order to be accepted by the FDA as fit for purpose is also a very important part of a guidance, because it ultimately creates better quality evidence from these data vendors that are aggregating this de-identified data. So it serves three purposes to the companies who are trying to put together applications, the FDA is regulating the applications, and the vendors in between who are building the data products that can be used for these purposes. My opinion of the December 2023 guidance is it's much better than the 2017 guidance. It's definitely more granular. Has some thoughtful. It's thoughtfully done, and it's definitely an advance. I've also been working in NEST, so I'm currently the vice chairperson of the executive committee of NEST, and also co-chair a working group on creating a data quality framework. There's also NEST also has a methodology framework that's being led by Jesse Berlin. And what we've been doing in those frameworks, both the data quality and methods frameworks, is to get even more granularity than the guidance documents, because and so we've developed much more extensive kind of lists and frameworks for both the methodology and the data quality. So I think that if you use those two together, and NEST is just about to release those two guidance document frameworks for public comment in the next few weeks. But I think if you use the FDA guidance in partnership with the NEST frameworks, that would help a lot. And I should mention that the NEST frameworks have been integrally, FDA has been integrally involved in those frameworks in create and commenting on them. So it has a lot of direct FDA input, and quite a bit of what went into the guidance came out of the NEST frameworks, because FDA had been working on that with academics and industry participants to come up with these frameworks for methods and data quality. So it was easy for FDA to incorporate that perspective into their guidance document in December of last year. I would just add one other thing on the guidance document, is that I think when we talk about real-world evidence, there's very different types of real-world evidence. I kind of break it down into three bigger categories. I'm sure there are many more categories, but three bigger categories. One is registries. The other one is electronic health records. or administrative insurance claims database. And the third one is digital data. And each of those requires different rules if they are going to be used for regulatory decisions. And I think that in trying to create a guidance document for all three of those types of evidence, sometimes it gets a bit blurred as to what do you need for this kind of evidence versus that kind of evidence. So, for example, a registry is something which is normally a careful collation of evidence into a structured database of evidence, whereas electronic health record studies generally health record of past treatment of patients and using that to make inference about whether a device is safe and effective. And digital data is the data that's collected in a robotic surgery, or even in non-robotic surgeries. More and more of the medical devices that are used in surgeries have digital sensors and digital content. And so that how that gets aggregated and used for causal inference about whether something is causing a safety problem or is effective requires a different set of rules. So I think my comment had been on the guidance document that kind of breaking out the evidentiary requirements into those three areas would have given more clarity.
Speaking to that point, one of the concerns about the document, based on the comments that were submitted, is that it was overly broad, and that the criteria that used to assess data relevance and reliability weren't clear enough. In fact, AdvaMed in its comments said it was kind of a we'll know it when we see it kind of approach. Is that something that you think? And again, you referenced the fact that the agency is working with other groups, Nest specifically. But that was another suggestion, was that there are a number of groups working in the real world evidence area, Nest, the Duke Margolis Center, the Society for Pharmacoeconomics and Outcomes research, and that the agency should take advantage of the work being done in those areas as well. But do you think that it could be narrowed a bit, and that perhaps the 2023 guidance is a bit too broad?
Yeah, I do think so. I mean, the FDA has a daunting challenge, because I believe that there are 4 million medical devices on the market. So if you're trying to cover everything, one kind of guidance that covers 4 million devices that do vastly different things. One is like a hip replacement or knee replacement that's in the person for 20 or 30 years. Another one is something that's used just to monitor something in passing, and so just vastly different types of devices and applications. So trying to have one size fits all is a big challenge that FDA has to address. And it's easy to point fingers when one doesn't have to do the work. But I do think that things will go in order to create more clarity is more a differentiation into different buckets. And we see that FDA itself has done this, because it has 4 medical devices at 7 different branches: one for orthopedics, one for cardiovascular, one for digital, and so in neurological. So in order to get the specificity that they need, they've broken it up into 7 offices of health technology. And I believe that ultimately the guidance will have to break out things into more categorization to get the granularity that's needed for some areas, but while covering multiple areas, but getting the granularity in each area.
One other area I would just want to touch on related to the guidance, and I think it's, again, your experience on both the pharma and the medtech side is very helpful in this area, relates to a guidance that was issued back in August of 2023 by FDA related to the use of real-world evidence for drugs. And a couple of the comments, specifically the Duke, Margolis, and Advamed comments, suggested that the FDA look to that guidance in crafting its Medtech guide. And so, the medical device industry spends a lot of time differentiating itself from drugs, because oftentimes when it comes to life science debates, broadly speaking, people who aren't as familiar with medtech tend to lump it in the same bucket with drugs. So oftentimes we look to kind of distinguish the industry. But is this a case where actually medtech could learn from the drug experience? And are there things that can be drawn from that August 23 drug guidance that could be useful for the medtech guidance?
Yeah, I think there are. I think so just coming back to the NEST work stream, a lot of the people on the NEST work stream are people who mostly do work on the pharma side, but also do work on the medtech side. So the NEST data quality and methodology work streams will incorporate all of the lessons that have been learned from the pharma side, that including in the August 2023 CDER guidance on real world evidence for regulatory decisions. So I think some of that is coming across through the NEST framework, and then through the NEST framework into FDA's work. There are fundamental differences between the generating evidence on the pharma side versus the medtech side. First and foremost is that the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations for medical devices, and is quite different to what it is for drugs. So for drugs, it's safety and safety and efficacy is the requirement. You have to demonstrate safety and efficacy. Whereas so efficacy generally precludes real world evidence. Generally real world evidence is more in the realm of effectiveness. And the FDA Code of Federal Regulations for medical devices is reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. So it's a different bar. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that it's the evidentiary standard that's built into the law that governs this is fundamentally different. The second thing is that the ability to detect devices in real world evidence is very different. It's much more of a challenge compared to what it is for pharmaceutical products or biologics, because for drugs and biologics, there's something called the NDC code, the National Drug Compendium Code, that'll tell you exactly which manufacturer, what product, what's the drug, who's the manufacturer, what's the dosage, and that's built into all the databases. So it makes study of specific products very easy. Whereas for medical devices, it's very difficult to find the specific medical devices. So have to do all these kind of workarounds and that are labor intensive and also differ. They differ from different healthcare systems. So when we did the NEST test case that led to a label expansion, which was the first label expansion that FDA had done using this kind of evidence. I believe it was the first label expansion that CDRH had done, but I think also CDER and CBER too. But we had to do like a lot of manual workaround with Yale and Mercy and Mayo, that each one had to individualize their way to find which devices were being used based on certain information systems that they had in their system. It wasn't in the electronic health record. They had to go back and find it in supply chains, and each one had a different supply chain system and model. So it points to the complexity that we face in finding medical devices. So those are two fundamental differences. But some of the things, and then, because of the evidentiary standard is different, some of the work on like validation of outcomes. So if you're proving something that's definitely safe and effective, you have to validate your outcomes in the electronic health records to a much greater standard compared to something where it's reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. That CDRH is requiring a lower standard of evidence, not at all, but there are different approaches. The other thing we see a lot on the medtech side is single-arm clinical trials, not RCTs. In drugs, it's very difficult to get a product approved without a phase 3 randomized controlled trial, or two at least. In medical devices, where we do see clinical trials, it's very often a single-arm clinical trial that's compared against performance goals, which are based off prior trials or other literature. And so as long as the single-arm clinical trial meets these performance goals, that's sufficient evidence. So that creates a whole different set of applications of real-world evidence and how real-world evidence can be used. So, for example, the famous example for the first label extensions for medical devices was the TAVRs, the aortic valve replacement procedures, which used to be open heart surgery, and they found that you could go through transarterial approaches, and in that that used registries, and the registries were often used like a clinical trial data and then a comparator arm from the registry, or the primary study was the registry and the control group was a clinical trial. So we're seeing these kind of mixes and matches of clinical trial data and real-world evidence in medical devices that we don't often see on the pharma sector because of the difference in the nature of the RCTs. So because of that, there are fundamental differences, but I do think that the CDRH guidance, CBER guidance of August 2023 was excellent guidance, and there were definitely things that could be brought into the medical device guidance, but not it would add, but it can't replace.
In the time we have left, I'd like to kind of look ahead and talk about where real-world evidence is going in medtech. And let me ask you to start by talking about two areas. One is the use of real-world evidence to minimize health equity gaps in clinical research. And the other, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about AI and how AI is being used to improve efficiency and productivity.
Great, thanks. Diversity, equity, inclusion is something that's very important to us at J&J, to me personally. May work well for people who have different genetic or physiological characteristics is very important. So that because our goal is to serve the population of patients that use our medical devices, and oftentimes identifying whether something works as well in a Black patient versus a white patient, or a female patient as a male patient, often is difficult to do in clinical trials. One of the ways, because it's number one, it's difficult to enroll, and number two, we don't often have the sample size to really break it out, and then be able to have enough sample size to look at differences within different race, ethnicity, or gender groups. And that's where real-world evidence can be incredibly important, because in real-world evidence we're capturing all the patients treated with the device. So we have a very large sample size, and we have a very diverse set of patients in that sample size. So we're able to break out and look at, for example, does the medical device or the treatment using the medical device work as well in different race ethnicity groups? Does it work as well in Hispanic patients or Black patients as it does in white patients? Does it work as well in women as it works in men? And sometimes we have found differences, and then it's important to highlight that so that the clinicians who are treating patients understand that and are aware of that. So in order to highlight that, it's important for us to publish it in scientific journals, and if necessary, put it in the label. one of the things we undertook was to look at the treatments for cardiac ablation through cardiac ablation to treat atrial fibrillation. Does that lead to does that work as well in Black patients and Hispanic patients as it does in white patients, as well as in women? And so we were mostly concerned that it shouldn't work less well. And what we actually found was that cardiac ablation works better in Black patients than it works in white patients, that there was less safety events and better efficacy outcomes. So that was comforting, at least, that we weren't missing a gap, that people were using the devices but not getting as good outcome because we just hadn't bothered to look at how well it was working. And more recently, we've been looking at trauma surgery products. So, for example, if someone breaks a leg or breaks an arm, what are the outcomes for Black, white, Hispanic patients, and do we see differences in the subsequent treatment after trauma, like nails or other solutions are used? And then the other area that you mentioned is in terms of AI, and AI actually has a very big role to play in surgery and medical devices. As I mentioned earlier, is moving to be more and more of a digital process. So the surgery is being planned, guided, and imaged and follow up through digital devices. So because surgery is going more digital, the digital data that's been generated is just huge amounts of data. One can get sometimes we get from one surgical procedure, say for cardiac ablation, the navigation and imaging data can amount to 2 terabytes of data from one procedure. That's very difficult to analyze unless you have something like an AI model that can take in huge amounts of data and synthesize out distinctive parameters. So one of the things that we've been doing is linking digital data that's collected during the surgery to patient electronic health record data. In the patient electronic health record data, we can see who gets a successful outcome from the cardiac ablation. Because, as I mentioned, cardiac ablation is about 20% effective, is 80% effective, but in 20% of patients, they have to go back for a redo, or and it doesn't always work, and so they may need a subsequent procedure to get it to work. So we can try and look at, well, which patients need a redo. In other words, where the first round didn't work, and then train all of this huge amount of digital data using an AI model to identify what are the features in the digital data that predict whether a patient has success or not. Or also we can do it on whether the patient has a safety outcome or not, and start to identify what are the digital parameters that a surgeon should follow in order to get the or electrophysiologists should follow in order to get the successful outcome, and start to use this to build tools to inform the electrophysiologist that during the procedure that based on your pattern of ablation, the algorithm predicts that the patient has a 30% chance of reoccurrence. But if you went back and fixed this part and used a bit more pressure here, or a bit more power here, or a bit more voltage drop in this area, you could lower this to 15%. So starting to building those real-time feedback processes so the surgeon can correct that. So all of that requires that AI model, because it's a prediction model, and because of the huge amounts of data, unstructured data, we can use AI to start to identify what are the important features that predict success of the surgery, and then start to build that in. So we have the hardware of the medical device, but we also have the software as a medical device that's assisting in making things safer and effective, and also helping newer surgeons get up to speed quicker.
Well, Paul, I really appreciate your insights into this whole area. I think it's fair to say that we're just looking at the tip of the iceberg in terms of the use and application of real world evidence for medtech products, particularly in the clinical trials, clinical research area. And I think it's something that obviously we're going to continue to follow in Market Pathways and here on the podcast, because it's something that I think product companies generally are going to rely on more heavily to make the process more efficient and productive. And J&J is among the pioneers in the medical device industry in terms of applying real world evidence. And again, we look forward to staying in touch with you and continuing to follow what we know will be an important area. So thanks so much for taking the time with us today.
Well, thank you, Stephen. I know you've been a leader for the last 25 years in medical device strategy and in many different forms have been a large contributor to creating coherence and insight in the field. So I thank you very much for your work, and it's a pleasure and honor to speak with you today.
We hope you enjoyed today's conversation with Paul Coplan of J&J regarding real-world evidence. This is an important topic, as we mentioned, and something that no doubt we will revisit both here on the podcast and in the pages of Market Pathways. And again, if you want to learn more about the use of real-world evidence in the medical device industry, and specifically MDIC and NEST, who are organizations pushing the boundaries of real-world evidence in medtech, I'd refer you to the numerous articles in Market Pathways that we've done on the topic. With that, we hope you enjoyed today's discussion and look forward to the next edition of the Market Pathways podcast.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. Your support is valuable and makes us better. Please remember to leave a review and rate Market Pathways on Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to listen.